Was it the contract that trapped her or the man who wrote it? The boardroom was silent except for the sound of rain beating against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Eleanor Cross sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the polished mahogany table, her eyes fixed on the single sheet of paper in front of her. 23 clauses, each one more specific than the last. Each one designed to control, to contain, to keep her at exactly the right distance. 6 months as his contracted companion, public appearances only. No personal questions, no emotional attachments. Payment upon completion. Enough money to save her family's crumbling legacy, to pull her father's company back from the edge of bankruptcy, to finally breathe again after 3 years of drowning in debt. All she had to do was pretend. Alexander Thorne didn't look up from his phone as his lawyer slid the pen across the table toward her. The billionaire sat at the head of the room like a king surveying his kingdom, his tailored suit sharp enough to cut glass, his expression carved from marble. At 34, he'd built an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Tech, real estate, investments that turned millions into billions overnight. And now, apparently, he was buying a girlfriend. Not a girlfriend, a contract. There was a difference. Eleanor reminded herself this was business, nothing more. She picked up the pen. Her hand didn't shake, though her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. 6 months. She could survive anything for 6 months. You understand the terms. Alexander's voice cut through the silence like a blade. He still hadn't looked at her. His attention remained fixed on whatever urgent message demanded his focus, his thumb scrolling with practiced indifference. I understand. No exceptions. No negotiations after signing. I said, I understand. Finally, he looked up. His eyes were the color of winter storms, gray and unforgiving. And they studied her with the same clinical precision he probably used to evaluate stock portfolios. She wondered what he saw. A desperate woman with nowhere else to turn. A convenient solution to whatever problem required a fake relationship, or just another transaction in a life built on calculated exchanges. Eleanor signed her name. The lawyer gathered the papers with efficient satisfaction. Alexander returned to his phone, and just like that, she'd sold 6 months of her life to a man who couldn't be bothered to watch her do it. Someone will send you the schedule, he said without looking up. First event is Friday. Gala black tie. My driver will collect you at 7. 3 days. She had 3 days to prepare to step into a world she'd only glimpsed from the outside, to learn how to move through spaces where champagne cost more than her rent, to become the kind of woman who could stand beside Alexander Thorne and make people believe she belonged there. The lawyer showed her out. The rain had intensified, turning the city beyond the windows into a watercolor blur of lights and shadows. Eleanor stood in the private elevator as it descended 47 floors, her reflection ghosting in the polished steel doors. She looked the same. She felt entirely different, like she'd crossed some invisible threshold she couldn't name. Her phone buzzed. A calendar invitation. Friday, 7 p.m. The Morrison Gala. Dress code. Formal, plus a note in cold, efficient text. Jewelry will be provided. Don't be late. She laughed, though nothing was funny. This was her life now. A contract. A schedule. A man who communicated through calendar invitations and couldn't spare 30 seconds of eye contact. 6 months she'd survive this. She had to. What Eleanor didn't know, what she couldn't have known as she stepped out into the rain-soaked street, was that Alexander Thorne had spent the last 3 hours after her interview running background checks that went deeper than any job application. He knew about her father's company, the creditors, the desperate choices that had led her to his office. He knew she'd turned down 2 other offers before accepting his. He knew she bit her thumbnail when she was nervous and that she'd changed her outfit 3 times before the meeting. And he knew something else. Something that made him watch her signature dry on that contract with an expression that would have looked like satisfaction to anyone who didn't know him well enough to recognize the difference. He knew she was lying about something. Some small detail in her background didn't match. Some piece of her carefully constructed story had a crack in it, hairline thin but unmistakable to someone who'd built a fortune on finding the flaws in other people's facades. Alexander closed his laptop and walked to the windows. 47 floors below, Eleanor Cross stepped into a taxi and disappeared into the city's arterial flow. He watched until the taillights vanished, then pulled up a file on his phone. Private investigator. The best money could buy. Someone who could find the secrets people buried so deep they forgot they were keeping them. Because Alexander Thorne hadn't become a billionaire by making careless mistakes, and he certainly didn't hire contracted companions without knowing exactly what he was buying. The question was, what had Eleanor Cross hidden from him? And more importantly, what would happen when he found it? 3 days until the gala. 3 days until they stepped into the spotlight together. Into a world of cameras and questions and people who could smell weakness like blood in the water. 3 days until Eleanor learned what it really meant to make a deal with a man who never ever lost. In her small apartment across the city, Eleanor hung up her wet coat and stared at the contract on her kitchen counter. 23 clauses. She'd read them so many times, she'd memorized the language. No personal questions, no emotional attachments, professional distance at all times. She touched the paper where Alexander's signature slashed across the bottom. Bold, aggressive, the handwriting of someone who'd never doubted a decision in his life. What she didn't tell him, what she couldn't tell him, was that she'd met him before 5 years ago one night. A conversation at a charity event that had lasted exactly 17 minutes before his phone rang and he disappeared without a goodbye. He wouldn't remember. Why would he? She'd been nobody then, a college student volunteering to feel like she was part of something bigger than her shrinking world. But she remembered. She remembered the way he'd actually listened when she spoke, the way he'd smiled, really smiled, not the cold corporate expression she'd seen today at something she'd said about ambition and fear being two sides of the same coin. She remembered thinking that behind all that wealth and power, there might be someone real. That's why she'd taken the contract. Not just for the money, but because somewhere in the back of her mind, she'd wondered, was that person still there? Or had 5 years of building empires killed whatever humanity she'd glimpsed that night? Eleanor picked up the contract and slid it into a drawer. 6 months to find out, 6 months to save her family. 6 months to pretend she didn't know the man she was supposed to fall in love with had already forgotten her once. Outside, the rain continued to fall. And somewhere across the city, in a penthouse office that touched the clouds, Alexander Thorne was making a phone call that would change everything. Find out everything, he said quietly. I want to know who she really is. Neither of them realized they were both searching for the same answer. The dress arrived on Thursday in a box that cost more than Eleanor's monthly rent. Midnight blue silk that caught the light like water, custom fitted without her ever being measured. She stared at it hanging in her modest closet, a dark jewel among bargain store cotton and 5-year-old blazers, and wondered what kind of surveillance it took to know someone's exact measurements without asking. The answer came in the form of a text message at 2 in the morning, when sleep had become impossible and she'd given up pretending. Unknown number, but she knew. The tailor used photos from your social media. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, no greeting, no signature. Just a statement of fact delivered in the same cool, efficient tone he used for everything else. Eleanor sat in the darkness of her bedroom, phone glowing in her hands, and typed 3 different responses before deleting them all. What did you say to a man who hired people to study your photos so he could buy you the perfect dress? She settled on, it's beautiful. The reply came instantly, as if he'd been waiting. Good. The necklace will complement it. My driver will be early. Traffic on Fridays. Then nothing. She waited for something else, some human acknowledgement that they'd just had a conversation at 2 in the morning, but the phone stayed silent. Eleanor set it down and returned to staring at the ceiling, wondering if Alexander Thorne ever slept or if he simply powered down like the machines he built his fortune on. What she didn't know was that across the city, in that penthouse office where the lights never went out, Alexander was staring at his own phone with an expression that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew him. He'd typed and deleted 7 messages before settling on those businesslike sentences. He'd almost asked if she was nervous, almost admitted he was calling in favors to make sure every detail of tomorrow night was perfect, almost said something that would have violated the careful distance he'd built into every clause of that contract. Instead, he pulled up the investigator's preliminary report. Elena Baskus, formerly Elena Cross, changed her name at 18 when her mother remarried. Father Richard Cross, CEO of Cross Industries, currently underwater on debt that should have bankrupted him 2 years ago. Someone was keeping him afloat, making quiet payments that didn't show up in official records. The investigator was still tracking the source, but that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was a notation from 5 years ago, a charity gala, the Pemberton Foundation. Eleanor's name on the volunteer list, his name on the donor registry. Same night, same event. Alexander closed his eyes and reached back through 5 years of deals and decisions and forgettable faces. He remembered the Pemberton Gala the way he remembered everything with perfect, photographic clarity. He remembered writing a check that made the foundation director's hands shake. He remembered a phone call from Tokyo that required immediate attention. But he didn't remember a volunteer with intelligent eyes who'd said something about ambition and fear. He should have remembered everything. That was his gift and his curious mind that catalogued every detail, every face, every word. So why couldn't he place her? Unless he didn't want to. Unless some part of him had locked that memory away because remembering meant acknowledging something he couldn't afford to acknowledge. That for 17 minutes at a charity event 5 years ago, he'd felt something other than the calculated emptiness that had become his normal state. That he'd met someone who looked at him like he was a person instead of a portfolio. And that he'd walked away because caring about anything except the next deal, the next acquisition, the next billion was a luxury he couldn't afford. Alexander opened his eyes and deleted the investigator's file. Whatever Eleanor Cross was hiding, he'd find it himself. The old-fashioned way. By paying attention to the spaces between her words, the hesitations before her answers, the way she'd looked at him in that boardroom like she recognized something he'd forgotten. Friday arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of perfect evening that made the city glow gold in the fading light. Eleanor spent the day in a state of controlled anxiety, teaching herself to walk in heels she'd never owned, practicing conversations she'd never have, trying to become someone she wasn't sure existed outside her imagination. The driver arrived at 6:30 early, just like Alexander had said. The car was exactly what she expected: black, expensive, windows tinted dark enough to hide secrets. What she didn't expect was the man waiting inside. Alexander sat in the back seat like he'd been there for hours, perfectly composed in a tuxedo that probably cost more than her father's remaining assets. He glanced up from his phone when she climbed in, and for just a moment so brief she might have imagined it, something flickered across his face. Surprise recognition. Something that looked almost like pain. Then it was gone, replaced by that carefully neutral expression she was learning to hate. "You look acceptable," he said, returning to his phone. Acceptable. Eleanor smoothed the midnight blue silk and watched the city slide past the windows. She'd spent 4 hours getting ready, and he'd given her the same assessment he'd probably give a quarterly report. Acceptable. Good enough. Meeting minimum standards. "Thank you," she said, pouring every ounce of sarcasm she possessed into those 2 words. He looked up again. This time the surprise stayed longer. "You're angry I'm contracted." There's a difference. Something that might have been amusement touched the corner of his mouth. "The contract doesn't require you to hide your feelings, just manage them appropriately in public." "Then let me manage this one." "You're an asshole." The almost smile became real, transforming his face into something younger, more human. "Better. The people we're meeting tonight can smell fear and false enthusiasm, but honest irritation. That they'll believe." Eleanor stared at him, realization dawning slowly. "You did that on purpose." "I did a lot of things on purpose, Miss Krause. The question is whether you're observant enough to figure out which." Once he set down his phone and opened a velvet box that had been sitting beside him. Inside, a necklace that caught the dying light and threw rainbows across the car's leather interior. Diamonds, she assumed, maybe sapphires, definitely worth more than her education. "May I?" he asked, and there was something different in his voice now, softer, almost uncertain. She nodded, turning so he could reach the clasp. His fingers brushed the nape of her neck, and she felt him hesitate. Just for a second, just long enough for her to wonder if he felt it too, that electric charge that shouldn't exist between 2 people who'd signed a contract specifically forbidding it. The necklace settled against her collarbone, cool and heavy. Alexander's hands lingered on her shoulders. In the rearview mirror, Eleanor caught the driver's eyes flicking away, pretending not to notice the way the billionaire and his contracted companion had both stopped breathing. "Eleanor," Alexander said quietly, and it was the first time he'd used her first name. "What happened 5 years ago?" Her heart stopped. He remembered, or he'd found out. Or he'd always known, and this whole thing was some elaborate game she didn't understand the rules to. "I don't know what you mean." His hands dropped away. The warmth that had been building between them vanished like smoke. "Of course you don't." The car pulled up to the Morrison Hotel, where searchlights swept the sky and cameras flashed like lightning. Through the tinted windows, Eleanor could see the crowd, the red carpet, the beautiful people who moved through this world like they owned it because they did. This was their territory. She was just visiting, wearing borrowed jewels and pretending she belonged. "Remember," Alexander said as the driver came around to open the door, his voice returning to that cool, professional tone. "You're here because you want to be. You chose this. Whatever they ask, whatever they assume, that's the story. We met at a gallery opening. You were looking at a Rothko. I was looking at you. Cliché, but believable. And how long have we been together? 3 months. Long enough to be serious. Not long enough to be permanent." The door opened. Sound and light flooded in, voices, music, the clicking of 100 cameras. Alexander stepped out first, then turned and offered his hand. Eleanor took it, letting him pull her into a world of flash and noise and faces that turned to assess her worth in milliseconds. His arm went around her waist, pulling her close. To anyone watching it would look natural, possessive but not aggressive. The gesture of a man who'd found something worth keeping. "Smile," he murmured against her ear. "And for God's sake, don't let them see you're terrified." But as they walked the carpet, as cameras exploded and voices called out questions, and Alexander introduced her to people whose names she recognized from magazine covers, Eleanor realized something that made her blood run cold. She wasn't terrified of the cameras or the crowd or the elegant sharks circling with champagne, glasses and calculated smiles. She was terrified because somewhere between the car and the red carpet, Alexander's hand had found the small of her back, settling there with a familiarity that had nothing to do with their contract. She was terrified because when he looked at her for the cameras, there was something in his eyes that looked dangerously close to real. She was terrified because she'd spent 5 years trying to forget 17 minutes with a man who'd actually seen her, and now she was standing next to him pretending those 17 minutes had never happened. Most of all, she was terrified because the way he was looking at her now, like she was the only real thing in a room full of beautiful illusions, was exactly how he'd looked at her 5 years ago, right before his phone rang and he disappeared. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast golden light over tables dressed in white and silver. Orchestra music drifted through conversations about mergers and acquisitions, about summer homes and winter yachts, about money discussed so casually it ceased to mean anything at all. Alexander kept his hand on her back as they moved through the crowd, introducing her to tech CEOs and venture capitalists. to socialites whose families had been wealthy since before America invented the word billionaire. Eleanor smiled and nodded and said all the right things, playing the role she'd been contracted to play. But she was watching him too, noticing the way his jaw tightened when someone mentioned his father, the way he deflected personal questions with practiced ease, the way he checked his phone compulsively, like he was waiting for news that never came, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, searching for something, as if her face held answers to questions he hadn't figured out how to ask. They were seated at a table near the front, surrounded by people who spoke in code about things that mattered to them and no one else. The woman to Eleanor's right, dripping in emeralds and entitlement, leaned over with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So how did you two really meet? And don't tell me that gallery story. Alexander doesn't do galleries unless someone's trying to sell him something." Eleanor felt Alexander tense beside her. This was a test, one she was apparently expected to pass without preparation. "You're right," she said, taking a sip of champagne to buy herself time. "The truth is, we met 5 years ago. At a charity event. We talked for about 17 minutes before his phone rang and he left without saying goodbye. I didn't think I'd ever see him again." The table had gone quiet. Alexander's hand found her knee under the table, his grip tight enough to hurt, and then the woman prompted, leaning forward like she'd been offered gossip worth more than gems. Eleanor looked at Alexander. He was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read, something between shock and understanding and fear. And then Eleanor continued softly, 5 years later, he walked into a room where I was waiting. And this time he stayed. The silence that followed her words felt infinite. Alexander's hand remained on her knee, his fingers rigid with tension that contradicted the calm expression he maintained for their audience. Around the table, faces shifted through calculations, some surprised, others intrigued, a few narrowing with a sharp assessment of people who'd built fortunes on reading between lines. The emerald woman recovered first, her laugh tinkling like breaking glass. "Well, that's certainly more romantic than a gallery, though." "I'm surprised Alexander remembered. He meets so many people." "I don't forget," Alexander said quietly, his eyes still locked on Eleanor's face. "I never forget." The conversation moved on, pulled by other currents, but Eleanor barely heard it, because Alexander's hand had loosened on her knee, his thumb now tracing small circles through the silk of her dress, a gesture so unconscious, so intimate, that it couldn't possibly be part of their contract. And because when she'd told that story, she'd seen something break open in his expression, some carefully maintained wall cracking just enough for her to glimpse what lived behind it. Recognition, not of her face, but of something deeper. The memory of who he'd been 5 years ago, before he perfected the art of being unreachable. The gala crawled forward through courses of food too beautiful to eat and speeches about charitable causes from people who'd never known hunger. Alexander played his role flawlessly, the attentive companion, the generous donor, the man who'd found something worth softening for. But Eleanor could feel the tension radiating from him, a frequency only she could detect. Every time someone approached their table, his posture shifted infinitesimally. Every time the conversation ventured toward personal territory, his responses became more guarded. He was afraid. The realization hit her somewhere between the third course and a speech about funding arts education. Alexander Thorne, who commanded boardrooms and bent markets to his will, who'd built an empire on calculated risks and perfect confidence, was afraid of whatever truth was assembling itself between them. When the dancing started, he stood and offered his hand without a word. Eleanor took it, letting him lead her onto a floor where couples swayed like paper dolls in expensive clothes. His arms circled her waist, pulling her closer than their contract specified. This close, she could smell his colon, something dark and woody that probably cost more per ounce than gold. This close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and decisions that weighed more than money. "Why did you tell them?" His voice was low, meant only for her. Around them, the orchestra played something slow and haunting, strings weaving through conversations and laughter. "Tell them what the truth about how we met." His hand spread wider on her back, anchoring her to him as they moved through the crowd. "You violated the contract. We agreed on the gallery story, did we?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Or did you just announce it in the car and assume I'd follow your script?" Something that might have been admiration flickered across his face. "You're not what I expected. Neither are you." They turned together, synchronized in a way that felt practiced despite this being the first time they'd touched like this. Eleanor wondered if he'd taken lessons, if there was some finishing school for billionaires where they learned to waltz while negotiating mergers. Then she felt the slight hesitation in his lead, the way his hand trembled almost imperceptibly against her spine, and realized he was as uncertain about this as she was. "I did remember," he said suddenly. "Not your face, not at first, but the conversation. Someone told me once that ambition and fear were two sides of the same coin. I've thought about that hundreds of times over the years, used it to make decisions worth billions. And I couldn't remember who said it." Eleanor's breath caught. "Why not?" "Because remembering would have meant admitting I walked away from something real. And I've spent 5 years telling myself real is a luxury I can't afford." His eyes searched hers, looking for something he seemed desperate to find. Was it real? Those 17 minutes? Before she could answer, a hand clapped on Alexander's shoulder, shattering the moment like a stone through glass. A man in his 60s, silver-haired and confident with the ease of old money, stepped into their space with a smile that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. Alexander, still hiding behind pretty faces. I see. Eleanor felt Alexander's entire body go rigid. His hand on her back became a vice, his jaw clenching with visible effort. When he spoke, his voice carried enough ice to freeze the ballroom. Thomas, I didn't realize they let you out on parole. The older man's smile widened. House arrest, actually, ankle monitor and everything, but they make exceptions for charity. He turned his attention to Eleanor, his gaze traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. And who might you be? Let me guess, aspiring actress, Instagram model, or just someone who needs money badly enough to ignore what everyone knows about the Thorne family. Eleanor Cross, she said evenly, though her heart was hammering. And I'm someone who doesn't judge people based on rumors spread by bitter men at charity galas. Thomas laughed, a sound like rust scraping metal. Oh, she's got spirit. Did he tell you about his father, Eleanor, about the real source of the Thorne fortune? Or did he feed you the same sanitized story he tells the press? That's enough. Alexander's voice cut through the music with enough force to turn heads around them. Conversations faltered. The orchestra played on, oblivious. Is it? Thomas leaned closer, his smile turning vicious. Because I think Ms. Cross deserves to know who she's contracted herself to. I think she deserves to know that every dollar in Alexander's accounts is built on one more word, and I'll have security remove you. And then I'll have my lawyers ensure you never attend another event in this city. They stood frozen in a tableau of barely contained violence, Alexander poised between control and chaos, Thomas savoring the damage he'd inflicted, Eleanor caught between them like collateral damage in a war she didn't understand. Then Thomas stepped back, hands raised in mock surrender. Of course, your event, your rules. But ask yourself, Ms. Cross, why does a man worth billions need to buy companionship? What is Alexander Thorne so afraid of that he can't risk anything real? He walked away, melting into the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime causing harm and escaping consequences. The orchestra kept playing. The dancing continued, but something had shattered, and Eleanor could feel the pieces cutting into the careful illusion they'd built. Alexander's hand dropped from her back. He stood perfectly still, his face a mask that revealed nothing and everything. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded like it came from very far away. I need air. He walked toward the terrace doors without looking back, leaving Eleanor alone in a sea of strangers. She stood there for a moment, feeling dozens of eyes assess her worth, her role, her place in whatever drama had just unfolded. Then she followed him, because whatever was happening between them, real or contracted, dangerous or safe, she needed to see it through to wherever it led. The terrace overlooked the city, 40 stories of glass and steel separating them from the world below. Alexander stood at the railing, his hands gripping the metal hard enough to turn his knuckles white. Eleanor approached slowly, giving him space to speak or stay silent, to push her away or pull her closer. My father, he said finally, his voice barely audible over the wind, was not a good man. He built his fortune on predatory lending, on taking advantage of people when they were desperate. He destroyed families, ended lives, and when he died 5 years ago, he left me an empire built on other people's suffering. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, close enough to touch but not touching. Below them the city glowed like scattered stars, millions of lives playing out in windows and streets, each one carrying its own weight of secrets and shame. I spent the first year trying to fix it, Alexander continued. Restructuring debt, making restitution where I could, trying to clean blood money with better intentions. But you can't erase the past, you can only try not to repeat it. He turned to look at her, and his eyes held a desperation she hadn't seen before. That's why the contract. That's why I can't risk anything real, because everyone who gets close to me eventually discovers what I'm built on, and they either run or they try to use it against me, like Thomas, like my father's former partners who think I owe them for keeping quiet about things I can't change. And you thought I'd run too. It wasn't a question. I thought if I kept it professional, if I maintained the distance, if I paid for your time and kept everything transactional, then when you found out the truth it wouldn't hurt. He laughed, a broken sound that cut through the night. But then you told that story about the charity gala about 17 minutes 5 years ago, and I realized it was already too late. Eleanor's mind was racing, pieces clicking together in patterns she hadn't seen before. 5 years ago, that was when your father died. 2 weeks after the Pemberton gala, heart attack, quick and painless, which was more mercy than he deserved. Alexander's hands loosened on the railing, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion that went bone deep. I was at that event trying to pretend everything was normal, trying to pretend I didn't know what I was about to inherit. And then I talked to someone who looked at me like I was just a person, not a legacy, not a burden, just someone worth 17 minutes of honest conversation. So you ran, Eleanor said softly. So I ran. And I've been running ever since. He turned to face her fully, and in the moonlight he looked younger, more vulnerable, stripped of all the armor wealth and power provided. The investigator I hired to look into your background called him off because I realized I didn't want to know your secrets. I wanted you to choose to tell me. I wanted something real, even though real is the one thing I've spent 5 years avoiding. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't known she was carrying. You want to know my secret, Alexander? You want to know why I took this contract? He nodded, holding his breath like her answer might break him. That conversation we had 5 years ago. Those 17 minutes, I went home that night and wrote them down, word for word, because I didn't want to forget what it felt like to talk to someone who actually listened. Someone who asked real questions and gave real answers. Someone who made me feel like maybe I could be brave enough to want more than safety and comfort. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. And when you walked into that boardroom 2 weeks ago, even though you didn't remember me, even though you were offering me a contract instead of a conversation, I took it. Because I needed to know if that person I met 5 years ago was real or if I'd imagined him. And his voice cracked on the word. And I think you've spent 5 years trying to kill him, but he's still there. Alexander, under all the walls and contracts and careful distance, is still there. For a long moment, they stood suspended in possibility. Two people caught between what they'd agreed to be and what they were becoming. Then Alexander reached out and touched her face, his palm warm against her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. I don't know how to do this, he whispered. I don't know how to be real. Neither do I, Eleanor admitted. But maybe we can figure it out together. He leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers, their breath mingling in the cold night air. They stood like that for seconds or minutes or hours, time losing meaning in the space between intention and action. And then Eleanor's phone buzzed in the small clutch she'd brought. Once, twice, insistent, she wanted to ignore it, wanted to stay in this moment where everything hung balanced on the edge of transformation. But the buzzing continued, urgent and demanding. She pulled away, fumbling for the phone, and Alexander's hand dropped to his side. The screen showed 7 missed calls from her father. 7 texts, each more frantic than the last. I have to, she started, but then the phone rang again, her father's name flashing like a warning. She answered. Dad, Eleanor, his voice was rough, afraid. Someone just bought out our remaining debt, all of it, anonymous payment, everything we owed, just ... gone. But they left a message with the bank. They said the debt is transferred to you now. They said if I don't do exactly what they ask, they'll collect from you instead. The world tilted. Eleanor gripped the railing to keep from falling, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. What do they want? Information. Her father's voice broke. About Alexander Thorne. They want to know everything you learn about him, everything he tells you. They said they'll be in touch with instructions. The line went dead. Eleanor stood frozen, the phone slipping from her hand. Behind her she heard Alexander take a sharp breath, and she knew somehow. He'd heard the terrace was small enough, the night quiet enough, his attention focused enough. When she turned, his face had returned to that carefully blank expression, but his eyes held something new. Not anger, not betrayal, something worse. Understanding, the recognition that whatever was growing between them had just been poisoned before it could bloom, that someone had just turned their moment of vulnerability into a weapon. Eleanor, he said quietly, and her name on his lips sounded like goodbye. Eleanor's hands were shaking. Not the delicate tremor of nerves, but the violent shake of someone whose entire foundation had just cracked open beneath her feet. She tried to speak, to explain, to make him understand that she hadn't known. But the words stuck in her throat like broken glass. Alexander took a step back, then another, putting distance between them with the same calculated precision he probably used to exit failing investments. His face had become a mask again, but she could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides, the rigid control it was taking him not to shatter completely. How long his voice was soft, dangerously soft, the kind of quiet that preceded explosions. Alexander, I didn't. How long have you been feeding them information? Each word was precisely articulated, stripped of emotion, which somehow made them worse. Was it from the beginning? Was the entire story about the charity gala part of the setup? Make me trust you, make me remember, make me vulnerable. No. The word came out as a gasp. I swear to God, I had no idea. My father's debt. I thought it was just creditors, normal financial. There's nothing normal about your father's debt. Alexander pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with furious efficiency across the screen. I've been watching it for 2 weeks. Someone's been making payments to keep him afloat, strategic amounts timed to keep him desperate but functional. I thought it was unusual, but I didn't. He stopped, his thumb hovering over the screen. I didn't think they were using him to get to me through you. The pieces were assembling in Eleanor's mind with sickening clarity. The creditors who'd called less often than they should have, the small reprieve that had allowed her father to keep the business limping forward, the way the bank had been so eager to point her toward Alexander's contract when she'd inquired about consolidation options. Not coincidence, design. She'd been steered toward this moment like a piece on a chessboard, moved by hands she'd never seen. Who are they? She whispered. Alexander laughed, but there was no humor in it. Who do you think? My father's former partners, the people Thomas represents, the ones who think I owe them for keeping quiet about the ugliest parts of the Thorne legacy. He finally looked up from his phone, and his eyes held something that looked like grief. They've been trying to get leverage on me for 5 years. I've blocked every attempt, every blackmail scheme, every planted scandal, every corporate raid. But this, he gestured at the space between them, at the fragile thing they'd been building that was now lying in pieces. This was elegant, patient. They found someone I might actually care about and made her dependent on them before I even knew she existed. Then we go to the police, FBI, whatever, there has to be something, and tell them what. Alexander's voice rose for the first time, frustration breaking through his control. That some anonymous entity bought legal debt and asked for information. That's not a crime, Eleanor. That's business. Unethical, maybe immoral, definitely, but not illegal. By the time we proved anything, they'd have whatever they want, and your father would be destroyed in the process. Eleanor sank onto one of the terrace chairs, her legs unable to hold her anymore. The diamonds around her neck felt like a noose. The dress that had made her feel beautiful now seemed like a costume for a role she'd never auditioned for. Everything was wrong. Everything was contaminated. What do I do? The question came out small, defeated. For a long moment, Alexander didn't answer. He stood at the railing, staring out at the city, his profile sharp against the night sky. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed again, not soft with hurt or hard with anger, but cold with calculation. The voice of a man who'd spent his life turning problems into equations and finding the most efficient solutions. You give them what they want. Eleanor's head snapped up. What information? About me, my business, my weaknesses, my secrets. He turned to face her, and his expression was unreadable. But only what I tell you to give them. We turned their trap into ours. I don't understand. They think they've backed us into a corner. They think you'll be so desperate to protect your father that you'll betray everything I tell you. Alexander moved closer, crouching down so they were eye level. But they made one critical mistake. They revealed themselves before they had anything valuable, which means we have time to feed them exactly the kind of information that will destroy them. Eleanor's mind was racing, trying to follow his logic through the fear and confusion. You want to use me as bait. I want to use us as bait. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and steady around hers. If we're going to do this, we have to commit completely. No half measures. They need to believe you're actually getting close to me, that I'm actually trusting you with real information. Which means ... double quotes, which means we have to make it real, Eleanor finished. As real as we can without actually being real. But something flickered in his eyes when he said it. Some uncertainty that suggested the line between pretending and reality had already begun to blur. Can you do that? Can you lie to people who have your father's life in their hands and make them believe you? Eleanor thought about her father, about the small office where he still went every day even though the company was dying, about the way he'd aged 10 years in the last 3, the weight of failure crushing him slowly, about the quiet pride he'd tried to maintain even as everything crumbled. She thought about what these people, whoever they were, would do to him if she refused. And she thought about Alexander standing on this terrace telling her about 17 minutes 5 years ago, his voice raw with a vulnerability she knew had cost him everything to reveal. Yes, she said, but I need you to promise me something. What? When this is over, when we've beaten them, or they've beaten us. When the contract expires and the debt is settled and we're free. She squeezed his hand, holding on like it was the only solid thing in a world gone liquid. Promise me we'll have 17 minutes. Just 17 minutes where nothing is strategy or performance or protection, where we can just talk, like real people. Alexander's expression cracked, just for a second, just long enough for her to see the want and fear warring behind his eyes. Eleanor, after everything you've just learned about me, about where I come from, why would you? Because I don't care about where you come from. She cut him off, her voice fierce. I care about those 17 minutes 5 years ago. I care about the man who just spent 10 minutes on this terrace telling me the truth even though it terrified him. That's who I want 17 minutes with. Can you promise me that? He stood abruptly, pulling his hand from hers, turning away. Eleanor watched him struggle with something internal, some battle between the walls he'd built and the person still trapped behind them. Finally he spoke without turning around. I promise. But Eleanor, you need to understand what you're agreeing to. These people, my father's partners, they don't play by rules. If they suspect you're working with me instead of against me, they won't just call in your father's debt. They'll destroy him publicly, professionally. They'll make sure everyone knows every mistake he ever made, every corner he cut, every compromise he accepted. They'll turn him into a cautionary tale. Then we don't let them suspect, which means you'll have to hurt me. He turned back and his face was serious. In private, where they might be listening, in texts they might be reading, you'll have to say things, do things, that make them believe you're betraying me. And I'll have to react like it's real. Like each piece of information you steal is actually damaging me. Eleanor stood, crossing to where he waited. She was still shaking, but with something different now. Not fear, determination. Then, teach me. Teach me how to be convincing. Teach me what they want to hear. It starts now. Alexander's voice was steady, but she could see the cost of what he was about to do written in the tension of his shoulders. I need you to go back inside. I need you to look devastated, betrayed, like I just told you something that proved everything Thomas said was true. Can you do that? What did you tell me? Eleanor asked, falling into the role even as her heart hammered against her ribs. That my father's partners are right. That every dollar I have is built on suffering. That I knew exactly what he was doing and I did nothing to stop it because I was too afraid of losing my inheritance. His jaw clenched. That I am exactly the monster everyone thinks I am. And are you? The question hung between them like smoke. Alexander stared at her, and she saw something break behind his eyes. Not his walls, they were still there, still strong, but something deeper. Some last hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would see him differently. I don't know, he whispered. Some days I think I spent so long pretending to be heartless that I forgot how to be anything else. Eleanor reached up and touched his face, her palm against his cheek, feeling the tension thrumming through him. Then we'll figure that out too after. In our 17 minutes, she let her hand drop and walked toward the terrace doors, preparing to shatter the illusion they'd built for an audience of vultures and cameras. But before she reached the threshold, Alexander's voice stopped her. Eleanor, she turned back. The investigator I hired. Before I called him off, he found something. About the payments keeping your father afloat. They're coming from a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Same corporate structure my father used for his worst dealings. Same lawyer he kept on retainer for 40 years. Alexander's hands were shaking now, his control finally fracturing. These people aren't just my father's partners. They're the architects of everything he built. And if they're coming after me this aggressively, using you, using your father, it means they're desperate. Which means I must have done more damage to their operations than I thought. Is that good or bad? It means we're not just trying to protect your father anymore. His voice was grim. We're trying to survive, because desperate people do desperate things. And these people have spent decades getting away with destroying lives. They're not going to let me dismantle their empire without a fight. The weight of what they were about to attempt settled over Eleanor like a shroud. This wasn't just about a contract anymore, or a debt, or even a fragile connection between two people trying to find something real in a world of transactions. This was about confronting a machine that had been grinding people into profit for longer than she'd been alive. This was about two people with no weapons except information and nerve, going to war with monsters who wore expensive suits and smiled at charity galas. How do we win? She asked. We don't. Alexander's smile was sharp and bitter. We just try to make sure that when everything collapses, we're not buried in the rubble. Eleanor nodded, straightened her spine, and stepped back into the ballroom. The music swelled around her, elegant and oblivious. Faces turned in her direction, reading her body language with the precision of people trained to spot weakness. She let them see what Alexander needed them to see: a woman walking away from something shattered. Her eyes bright with unshed tears, her shoulders curved in defeat. She didn't look back at the terrace, didn't give any indication that this was performance rather than reality. Just walked through the crowd toward the exit, ignoring the whispers that followed her like smoke, feeling dozens of eyes catalog her departure for future gossip. Her phone buzzed in her clutch, a number she didn't recognize. She stopped in the marble lobby, beneath a chandelier that cost more than her life, and opened the message. Wise choice, Miss Cross. Your first report is due tomorrow. Tell us about his security protocols, his schedule, the names of his lawyers. Prove you're committed, and your father stays safe. Disappoint us, and he'll lose everything by the end of the week. No signature, no threat that could be traced. Just cold efficiency from people who'd been doing this longer than she'd been alive. Eleanor looked back through the ballroom doors. Alexander had returned to the party, his mask perfectly in place, laughing at something a woman in diamonds was saying, playing his role, showing no weakness, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand gripped his champagne glass tight enough to shatter it. They were committed now, both of them, to a plan that could save them or destroy them, to a performance that might become real or might tear them apart, to 17 minutes of truth that waited on the other side of whatever nightmare was unfolding. Eleanor typed a single word in response to the unknown number, tomorrow. Then she walked out into the night, where Alexander's driver waited with the car, and tried not to think about how many ways this could end. Tried not to calculate the odds of survival when you bet everything on a connection that might be real or might be just another beautiful lie. Behind her, through the glass and marble and manufactured elegance, Alexander watched her go. His hand finally crushed the champagne glass, crystal and blood mixing on his palm, and nobody noticed because he was very, very good at hiding pain. The war had begun, and neither of them knew if they'd recognize each other when it was over. The apartment Eleanor returned to that night felt smaller than she remembered. The walls pressed in. The silence screamed. She stood in the center of her living room, still wearing the midnight blue dress and diamonds worth more than everything she owned, and tried to remember how to breathe. Her phone sat on the coffee table like a loaded gun. Any minute now, it would ring. Alexander would call with instructions, or her father would call with more fear in his voice, or the unknown number would demand information she didn't have yet. The waiting was its own kind of violence. She unclasped the necklace with shaking hands. set it carefully on the table next to her phone. Then she sat down and cried, not the delicate tears of someone sad, but the ugly, gasping sobs of someone whose life had just split in two before and after. Before she knew she was a weapon. After she became one. The cry lasted 7 minutes. She timed it. Because at some point during those 7 minutes, rage replaced grief. Hot and clean and clarifying. These people, whoever they were, whatever they wanted, had turned her into a chess piece without her consent, had used her father's desperation, her own need, and twisted something that might have been real into a tool for destruction. Well, two could play that game. Eleanor wiped her face, straightened her spine, and picked up her phone. Not to wait for instructions to take control. She opened a new message to Alexander. They want security protocols. Schedule lawyer names. Tomorrow, what do I give them? The response came in seconds. He'd been waiting to. Nothing real. I'm sending you a file. Memorize it. Burn it. Every detail is designed to lead them into traps. 3 minutes later, her email chimed. A document encrypted, titled simply Architecture. She downloaded it, read it once, then again, her mind cataloging every carefully constructed lie. Fake meeting times, names of lawyers who didn't exist but whose backgrounds would check out under surface investigation. Security protocols that would seem legitimate but actually led to dead ends and surveillance footage. It was brilliant, meticulous. The work of someone who'd been planning for this threat long before it materialized. At the bottom, a single line not meant for the document. Meant for her. Trust nothing, question everything, including me. Eleanor stared at those 3 words until they blurred. Including me. Even now, even when they were supposed to be allies, he was warning her not to trust him. Because trust was a luxury neither of them could afford, or because he didn't trust himself not to sacrifice her if it meant winning. She deleted the email, deleted the document, then spent 2 hours transcribing the key details into a format that would look like she'd gathered them. Naturally scattered notes, half-finished thoughts, the kind of information someone would collect piece by piece while earning someone's confidence. By 3 in the morning she had her first report ready, convincing, damning, completely false. She sent it to the unknown number with a message. This is what I have so far, more coming. The response was immediate. Excellent work. Your father's deadline is extended. Continue. Eleanor set down the phone and walked to a window. Outside, the city glowed with the lives of millions of people who had no idea they were surrounded by wars like this. Quiet wars fought with information and leverage, where the casualties were measured in bankruptcies and broken families rather than blood. She wondered how many other people were standing at windows right now, trapped in games they never agreed to play. Her phone rang. Not a text this time. A call. Alexander's name on the screen. Did they accept it? His voice was rough, exhausted. They extended my father's deadline. Good, that gives us 48 hours before they expect the next report. She heard something in the background, glass clinking, liquid pouring. He was drinking. Eleanor, there's something you need to know about tomorrow. What about tomorrow? I have a board meeting. Real one, not the fake schedule you just sent them. The board is voting on whether to dissolve my father's original partnerships and restructure the company's foundation completely. It's what I've been working toward for 5 years, cutting out the rot, returning money to the people he hurt, building something clean. He paused. If I win the vote, these people lose billions. If I lose, they maintain control and I'm out. Eleanor's mind raced through implications. That's why they're moving now. They know the vote is coming. They've known for months. This whole thing with you, with your father, it's not just about leverage. It's about distraction. They want me paranoid, looking over my shoulder, wondering if you're really betraying me. They want me unfocused when I walk into that boardroom. Will it work? Silence. Long enough that Eleanor wondered if he'd hung up then. I don't know, because the really fucked up part is that even though I know you're on my side, even though I know the information you're feeding them is fake, there's this voice in my head that sounds exactly like my father, and it keeps asking, what if she's playing both sides? What if she's better at this than you are? What if you're about to lose everything because you let yourself care about someone? Alexander, don't. Don't tell me it's going to be okay or that you'd never betray me, because we both know that if they push hard enough, if they threaten your father directly enough, you'd do exactly what they want and you'd be right to. That's the trap, Eleanor. They've made it so that the rational choice and the moral choice are the same thing. Protect your father. Give them what they want. Eleanor closed her eyes. He was right. If it came down to Alexander's empire or her father's life, she knew which one she'd choose, and hating herself for it wouldn't change the math. So what do we do? She asked quietly. We move faster than they expect. The board meeting is at 9. If I win, I have the power to protect your father directly, buy out his debt, legitimately, shield him from retaliation. If I lose, we're both fucked anyway, so it won't matter what you told them. She heard him take a drink. But I need you to do something for me. Something that's not part of the plan. What? I need you to be there, at the meeting, not hiding, not as part of some strategy, just there, in the room. Because if I'm going to burn down everything my father built, I need to see one face that isn't calculating how to profit from the ashes. The request was so unexpected, so vulnerable, that Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest. They'll know then, you're bored. Everyone that I'm not just a contract I know. They'll use it against you probably. It violates every strategy you just... Eleanor. His voice cut through her protests. I spent 5 years building walls because I thought safety and isolation were the same thing. I thought if I never let anyone close, never trusted anyone completely, I could control everything. And you know what? I was almost right. Almost, but almost doesn't win board meetings, almost doesn't dismantle empires, and almost sure as hell doesn't give you 17 minutes of something real. He paused. So I'm making a choice. A stupid, irrational, completely strategic choice. I'm choosing to trust that you being there will make me stronger instead of weaker. And if I'm wrong, if this all falls apart, at least it'll fall apart because I tried to be human instead of a machine. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cold window glass. What time should I be there? 8:30. Wear something that makes you feel strong, not expensive. Strong, Alexander. What if we lose? Then we lose together. And that'll be a first for both of us. He hung up before she could respond. Eleanor stood at the window for another hour, watching the city slowly wake up, lights coming on in apartments, cars beginning to flow through streets, the machinery of millions of lives clicking into motion. Somewhere out there, Alexander wasn't sleeping either. Somewhere out there, the people who'd trapped them were planning their next move. And somewhere, her father was probably staring at his own ceiling, wondering why the debt collectors had suddenly gone silent. At 6, Eleanor showered. At 7, she stood in front of her closet trying to find something that made her feel strong in a wardrobe built for survival rather than confidence. She settled on a simple black suit she'd bought for job interviews 3 years ago. It didn't fit the world she was about to walk into, but it fit her, and maybe that was the point. Her phone buzzed. A message from her father. Are you okay? Haven't heard from you since the gala. The bank called, said someone made a payment. Do you know anything about this? She typed back. I know. I'll explain everything soon. I promise. I love you. Then another message. Unknown number. Remember what's at stake. Miss Cross, your next report is due tonight. Don't disappoint us. And finally, Alexander. Cars outside. Ready. Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror one last time. The woman staring back looked tired, scared, determined, human. She picked up her phone and the necklace evidence leveraged a reminder of what was real and what was performance, and walked out the door. The car ride was silent. Alexander sat beside her in a suit that probably cost more than her education. His face and mask of calm that didn't match the tension radiating from every muscle. He didn't take her hand, didn't offer reassurance. Just stared out the window at the city passing by like he was memorizing it. What happens if you win the vote? Eleanor asked as they pulled up to a building of glass and steel that seemed to slice the sky in half. I destroy my father's legacy. Make a lot of powerful people very angry. Probably paint a target on my back for the rest of my life. He finally looked at her. What happens if I lose? They control the company, control you, and you become useless to them, which means your father becomes useless. Which means he didn't finish. Didn't need to. They rode the elevator to the 42nd floor in silence. Eleanor could feel her heart trying to escape her chest. When the doors opened, they stepped into a reception area designed to intimidate with marble and chrome, an original artwork that probably costs more than small countries. A woman in a crisp suit looked up, her expression flickering with surprise when she saw Eleanor. Mr. Thorne, the board is waiting, but I wasn't aware you'd be bringing a guest. Last-minute addition, she stays with me. His voice left no room for argument. They walked down a hallway lined with photographs of men in expensive suits, shaking hands over deals that had shaped industries. Alexander's father appeared in several, his smile sharp and predatory. Alexander didn't look at them, just walked past like they were ghosts that no longer had power over him. The boardroom was exactly what Eleanor expected. Long table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city Alexander's father had once treated like a personal playground. 12 people sat around the table, their faces ranging from hostile to carefully neutral. At the far end, in what should have been Alexander's seat, sat someone Eleanor recognized from the gala. Thomas, the man with cold blue eyes and a smile like rust. The man who'd planted the poison that had led to everything unraveling on that terrace. He smiled when they entered. Alexander, how unexpected. And you've brought your contract, girlfriend. How very modern of you. Alexander's hand found the small of Eleanor's back. Not a performance this time, anchoring, steadying. Shall we begin? Thomas gestured to the empty seats. By all means, let's vote on whether to destroy everything your father built. I'm sure the board is eager to hear your arguments for corporate suicide. Eleanor sat beside Alexander, feeling 12 pairs of eyes, assess her worth, her role, her existence. She wanted to disappear. Wanted to be anywhere but in this room where billions of dollars and countless lives hung in balance. But Alexander had asked her to be here. To be one face that wasn't calculating profit from ashes, so she stayed, and watched, and waited to see if truth could actually win against machines designed to grind it into dust. Alexander stood, placed a folder on the table, and began to speak in a voice that carried the weight of 5 years. Work and a lifetime's worth of shame transformed into purpose. 5 years ago, my father died and left me an empire. It took me 6 months to understand what that empire was actually built on. Predatory lending that targeted the desperate, real estate schemes that displaced families, investment strategies that profited from other people's failure. He looked around the table, meeting every pair of eyes. Some of you knew, some of you helped, all of you benefited. And now I'm asking you to vote to dismantle it, to return what can be returned, to rebuild what can be rebuilt, to stop being parasites and start being human. Inspiring. Thomas's voice dripped acid and financially catastrophic. You're asking us to vote against our own interests, to choose morality over profit. In what world does that make sense? In a world where we want to sleep at night. Alexander opened the folder. But since you prefer numbers to conscience, let me show you what happens if we don't restructure. I've spent 5 years documenting every illegal deal, every bribe, every scheme. I have evidence that would put half this board in prison and destroy the other half's reputations. It's all ready to go to the FBI, the SEC, and every major news outlet. He paused. Unless you vote yes, then it disappears. We rebuild, we do better, and nobody has to know how ugly it really was. Silence. Electric. Dangerous. Eleanor watched faces around the table shift through calculations: fear versus greed, self-preservation versus profit. Thomas stood slowly, his smile gone. You're blackmailing us. I'm offering you a choice. Same choice my father never gave his victims. Alexander's voice was steel. Take it or leave it. The vote happened in stages, hands raised. Voices called, Eleanor counting along in her head. 5 yes, 4 no, 3 abstentions. It came down to one person. A woman at the far end of the table who'd sat silent through everything, her face unreadable. She looked at Alexander, then at Thomas, then she raised her hand. Yes, the room exhaled. Thomas's face went pale, then red, then settled into something cold and calculated that made Eleanor's blood freeze. Congratulations, Alexander. You've won. For now, he gathered his papers with deliberate care. But here's what you don't know. That evidence you're so proud of, we have something better. We have her. He pointed at Eleanor. We have proof that everything you just said, every moral argument, every claim to be better than your father, it's all built on the same foundation. Contracts, transactions, buying loyalty instead of earning it. Alexander's hand tightened on the table. Eleanor has nothing to do with, oh, but she does. Because the board deserves to know why she's really here, not because she believes in you. Because we're paying her to spy on you. Because every moment of whatever you think is happening between you is actually just business. Thomas pulled out his phone, turned it so the room could see. Eleanor's messages, her reports, the false information she'd fed them displayed like evidence. This is who you're defending, Alexander. Someone who sells your secrets to your enemies. The room erupted, voices overlapping, board members demanding explanations, Thomas's smile returning as chaos bloomed around them. Eleanor sat frozen, watching her carefully constructed lies being weaponized against the truth. Watching Alexander's face close down, walls slamming back into place, even though they both knew this was the plan. This was strategy, but knowing something intellectually and watching it play out were different things. And when Alexander looked at her with an expression that seemed genuinely wounded, genuinely betrayed, Eleanor wondered where performance ended and reality began. Everyone out, Alexander said quietly. The room didn't hear him. I said everyone out. This time the command cut through noise. Board members fled like they'd been released from something toxic. Thomas moved toward the door last, pausing beside Eleanor. Tell him the truth, he whispered. Tell him which parts were real. Then he was gone. And Eleanor sat alone with Alexander in a room full of ghosts and broken things. Alexander stood at the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with something that looked like exhaustion but felt like defeat. The city sprawled below them, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in glass towers built to touch the sky. Eleanor didn't move, didn't speak, just waited in the silence that felt like standing on the edge of something ending or beginning, impossible to tell which. Say something, she whispered finally. What do you want me to say? His voice was flat, empty, that I knew this was coming, that it was all part of the plan, that watching Thomas display your messages to the board was just another move in the game. He turned, and his face was terrible in its blankness. Or do you want me to say the truth? That for about 30 seconds, when he showed those reports, when he said you were spying on me, I forgot it was strategy. I forgot we planned this. And I felt exactly what my father probably felt every time someone betrayed him. Alexander, do you know what that means? He moved toward her, not threatening but desperate. It means they were right. Thomas, my father's partners, everyone who said I'm just like him, because the first place my mind went wasn't trust, it was betrayal. Even knowing the truth, even having planned every detail, some part of me was ready to believe you'd actually sold me out. He laughed, a sound like breaking. 5 years of trying to be different, and it took 30 seconds to prove I'm exactly what I was built to be. Eleanor stood, walked to where he'd stopped, leaving careful distance between them. You're wrong. About which part? All of it. Because the man your father was, he wouldn't have spent 5 years trying to fix what he broke. He wouldn't have given me a choice on that terrace. And he sure as hell wouldn't be standing here right now admitting he was scared instead of pretending to be made of stone. She took a step closer. You felt betrayed for 30 seconds. Then what happened? Alexander stared at her. Then I remembered. You remembered the plan. You remembered that we're on the same side. You remembered that 30 seconds of fear doesn't erase 5 years of choice. Eleanor reached out slowly, giving him time to move away. He didn't. Her hand found his. Your father wouldn't have remembered. He would have destroyed me and convinced himself it was justice. That's the difference. That's how I know you're not him. For a long moment, they stood like that, hands joined, gap closing, breathing in synchronization that felt accidental but wasn't. Then Alexander pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her like she was the only thing keeping him from flying apart. She held him back, feeling him shake with something that might have been tears or rage or relief. The vote passed, he said against her hair. We won. I know your father's debt. I can clear it now. Legitimately, no strings, no contracts. I know that too. He pulled back just enough to see her face. His eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted, but clearer than she'd seen them. Which means our contract is fulfilled. You did what you agreed to do. You're free. Eleanor felt her heart trip over itself. Free, unless he stopped. Started again. Unless you want those 17 minutes we talked about. The real conversation. No performance, no strategy. Just two people trying to figure out if what they felt in the spaces between the lies was actually real. Now, Eleanor looked around the boardroom, at the scattered papers and empty chairs, at the evidence of a battle fought and barely won. Here. Why not here? This is where it started. Where you walked in wearing armor and I pretended I didn't remember you. Where we signed a contract because we were both too afraid to ask for something real. He led her to the window, to the view that stretched out like possibility. Seems fitting to end it here too, or begin it. Whichever this is. They sat on the floor beneath 42 stories of air and ambition, their backs against the window, looking at the empty boardroom instead of the city. Equals in exhaustion, partners in survival. Tell me something true, Eleanor said. Not strategic. Not protective, just true. Alexander thought for a long moment. I don't know how to do this. Relationships, emotions, trust. It's like everyone else got an instruction manual and I got a calculator. I can analyze risk and probability, but I can't calculate whether what I feel when you're in a room is real or just my brain trying to solve the loneliness equation. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. He laughed, actually laughed. God, we're a mess. The best kind. Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. My turn. Something true. I took the contract because I needed the money. But I kept showing up because somewhere between the gallery story and the gala and the terrace, I started hoping that the man I met 5 years ago wasn't gone. That he was just buried under walls and fear and could maybe be excavated. And every time you let one wall crack, even just a little, I wanted to stay long enough to see what was underneath. And what did you find? Someone afraid of being his father. Someone who turned shame into purpose. Someone who asks for 17 minutes like it's everything because maybe, for him, it is. She turned to look at him. Someone worth more than any contract could contain. Alexander's hand found her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that still felt new and frightening for both of them. What if I disappoint you? What if without the contract, without the structure, I don't know how to be what you need? Then we figure it out. Together, making mistakes and fixing them and probably screwing up 1,000 more times. Eleanor covered his hand with hers. That's what real is, Alexander. It's not perfect. It's not calculated. It's just two people choosing each other even when it doesn't make sense. He kissed her then. Not the calculated kiss of someone playing a role, but something raw and uncertain and completely honest. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard, both looked terrified, both were smiling. 17 minutes are up, Alexander said softly. Already. Actually, it's been 43 minutes. But who's counting? He stood, pulling her up with him. So here's what happens next. I'm going to spend the next month cleaning up the wreckage of my father's empire, returning money, making restitution. Probably making a lot of powerful people very angry. It's going to be ugly and complicated and I'll probably need to focus completely on not screwing it up. Eleanor felt her heart sink. This was the goodbye. The part where reality crashed back in and contracts ended and people went back to their separate lives. I understand. I'm not finished. He pulled her closer. And while I'm doing that, you're going to do whatever you need to do. Help your father rebuild his company. Figure out what you actually want instead of what survival demands. Maybe write down some of those thoughts you have about ambition and fear, because 5 years later they're still the smartest thing anyone's ever said to me, Alexander. And then, when the wreckage is cleared and the rebuilding starts and we both remember how to breathe without checking over our shoulders, we're going to have dinner, a real one. No contracts, no cameras, no audience except each other. And we're going to see if this thing between us can survive without crisis to hold it together. What if it can't? The question hurt to ask. Then at least we'll know. At least we tried. He kissed her forehead. But Eleanor, I don't think that's how this ends. Because the only times in my life I've felt like I could be someone other than my father's son were those 17 minutes 5 years ago and every moment with you since. And I'm not ready to give that up, are you? Eleanor pulled him close, holding on like she could anchor them both to this moment, to this choice, to the terrifying possibility that something real could actually survive. No, I'm not ready either. They left the boardroom together, walked through the building where Alexander's father had built an empire on other people's suffering, past the photographs of handshakes and deals, past the evidence of everything money could buy except humanity. Alexander stopped at his father's portrait in the lobby, a man with Alexander's eyes but none of his uncertainty, none of his capacity for doubt or growth or change. I used to think I had to choose, Alexander said quietly, between being like him or being weak, between having power or having a heart. But watching you walk into that boardroom this morning, knowing you were terrified but coming anyway because I asked, that wasn't weak. That was the strongest thing I've ever seen. He turned away from his father's portrait. Maybe strength isn't about walls and control. Maybe it's about letting people see you're afraid and trusting they won't use it as a weapon. Outside, the city moved on. People rushing to meetings that mattered to them, living lives full of their own complications and triumphs and quiet desperations. Eleanor and Alexander stood on the sidewalk, two people who'd met in a contract and found something neither of them had been looking for. I should go, Eleanor said, not moving. You should. Alexander didn't let go of her hand. My father needs to know he's safe, that the debt is cleared. I'll have my lawyers contact him today. Clean paperwork, nothing that ties back to any of this. And the people who used him, Thomas and his partners, they lost the vote, lost control of the company. I'll spend the next few years making sure they lose everything else too. His expression hardened, but legally, carefully. No more wars where innocent people become collateral damage. Eleanor nodded, then surprised them both by pulling him into a kiss that felt like a promise and a goodbye and a beginning all at once. When they broke apart, she was crying and smiling and he was doing the same. 1 month, she said. Give or take. I'll text you. No contracts. No contracts. Just dinner and conversation and seeing where it goes. He touched her face one more time. Eleanor, thank you. For 17 minutes 5 years ago that I was too stupid to remember. And for every minute since that I won't let myself forget. She walked away then. Had to, before she changed her mind and stayed in a moment that needed to end so something else could begin. She didn't look back. Didn't need to, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't running from something. She was walking toward it. 3 weeks later, Eleanor's father called with news that his company had been bought out by an investment firm specializing in restructuring distressed businesses. Fair price, respectful terms, a chance to exit with dignity instead of destruction. He cried on the phone, and so did she, and neither of them mentioned the contract or the debt or how close they'd come to losing everything. 4 weeks later, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a message from Alexander. Just an address and a time. No explanation. No context. She showed up anyway, to a small restaurant in a neighborhood far from glass towers and charity galas, where the food was good and the people were real, and nobody cared who you were or what you were worth. Alexander sat at a corner table wearing jeans and a sweater, looking younger and more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. When he saw her, his whole face changed, fear giving way to relief, giving way to joy so pure it made her chest ache. You came, he said, standing. Did you think I wouldn't? Honestly, I wasn't sure. A month is a long time. People change their minds. Eleanor sat across from him, reached across the table, took his hand. Not about this. Not about you. They talked for hours. About everything and nothing. About his work dismantling his father's legacy and how some days it felt like progress and other days like trying to empty an ocean with a teaspoon. About her helping her father transition out of the business and rediscovering what she wanted to do instead of what survival demanded. About fear and hope and the strange space between knowing someone through crisis and learning them in peace. At some point, the restaurant emptied around them. At some point, the staff politely suggested they might want to continue their conversation elsewhere. At some point, they ended up walking through the city as it transformed from day to night, talking like they'd never run out of words. Can I ask you something? Eleanor said as they crossed a bridge over water that reflected 1,000 lights. That first day in the boardroom, did you really not remember me, or were you protecting yourself? Alexander stopped walking, looked at her with something raw in his eyes. I told myself I didn't remember. Convinced myself that conversation 5 years ago wasn't important enough to catalog, but the truth. He took a breath. The truth is, I remembered everything. Your voice, your ideas, the way you looked at me like I was a person instead of a portfolio. And it terrified me, because remembering meant admitting I'd walked away from something real because I was too afraid to reach for it. And now I'm still afraid. But I'm more afraid of walking away again. He pulled her close, and they stood on the bridge like an island in the current of people flowing around them. So here's what I'm proposing. No contract this time. No terms or clauses or expiration dates. Just two people agreeing to try. To show up, to be honest even when it's terrifying. To build something real on purpose instead of by accident. Eleanor felt tears on her face. Happy ones this time. That sounds like the scariest contract I've ever heard. Is that a yes? That's a yes. They kissed on the bridge, surrounded by strangers and light and possibility. And somewhere in that moment, Eleanor realized something that made her laugh against his mouth. What? Alexander pulled back, smiling. We never finished our 17 minutes. We keep getting interrupted. Then I guess we'll have to keep trying. For the rest of our lives if necessary. He took her hand. Come on, I know a place we can actually finish a conversation. They walked into the night together. Two people who'd met through a contract designed to keep them apart and found a connection that refused to be contained by clauses or terms or fear. Behind them, the city glowed with millions of stories unfolding in parallel, some ending, some beginning, all of them messy and complicated and beautifully, impossibly human. The question that had started everything, was it the contract that trapped her, or the man who wrote it had finally found its answer? Neither. It was fear that had trapped them both. Fear of being like his father, fear of being vulnerable, fear that real connection was too dangerous to risk. But love, Eleanor thought, as they disappeared into the city's embrace, love was what happened when two people decided the risk was worth taking anyway. When they chose each other not despite the fear but through it. When a contract meant to keep distance became the bridge that brought them together. And maybe that was the real secret that powerful people spend billions trying to avoid. You couldn't buy connection, couldn't contract emotions, couldn't control love into existence. You could only show up, be honest, and hope the person across from you was brave enough to do the same. Some things, it turned out, were worth more than any empire. Worth more than safety or control or carefully constructed walls. Some things, like 17 minutes that stretched into forever, couldn't be bought at any price. They could only be chosen.